for all the privilege it is to be sitting here and being able to share this moment with the country at large, and it's for the country, and for so many years I've been so passionate about the cause of ISRO and space. I've lost track of how many hundreds of hours of conversations we've done. Today everybody's discussing it for obvious reasons. It's a national moment. Wow. Something special. And to mark something special, we have a special guest joining us now on the broadcast, and let me jump straight to it. The information flashing on your screens, of course, is telling you that the countdown sequence for landing is now locked, which means it's an automatic sequence. Now it's up to the lander and the rover and their machinery on board to manage the rest of it. It's going to be a second by second breakdown, which we're going to be showing you on our screens as we continue going ahead. Let me move on and introduce our special guest joining us is Chris Hadfield. He's the former commander of the International Space Station. And, Mr. Hadfield, appreciate your time that you've taken out to, help us mark this moment here in India. It's for us, it's a big deal. We're going to have the Indian flag on the moon, and hopefully, fingers crossed, many more such journeys to come. I have to ask you, sir, considering your experience, what's your first impression of Chandrayaan 3?
Well, it's an enormous challenge to try and do something new. It takes bravery, it takes skill, and it takes a willingness to learn from mistakes. But based on Chandrayaan 1, which showed us that there is water on the moon, and then Chandrayaan 2, which has been orbiting the moon ever since, helping to map where it is that Chandrayaan 3 is going to land, my confidence is very high. But we need to remember, we've just had numbers 1, 2, and 3. There are a lot of numbers after that, and this is leading to the future.
Yeah.
This is showing us what's possible. If you took the moon and flattened it out on the world, it would be bigger than Africa. It's as if we've just started to be able to explore an entire continent that's bigger than Africa and completely unused. And so the opportunity is enormous, scientifically and economically and technologically. And Chandrayaan 3, with its 4 legs coming down to try it and gently touch down on the surface, is putting in the footprints that are really leading to the future. So I'm very excited about it. I'm very proud of the people that are working on it, but I'm really interested in where it's going to lead us in the future.
Mr. Hadfield, we are taking deep interest also, but what is the progress that you are seeing from a global picture about India's space program and India's space exploration?
I work with several Indian space companies. I help run an international technology incubator called the Creative Destruction Lab. And there are some excellent up-and-coming Indian space companies right now. I work with Dhruva, as some really bright people who are regularly putting things into orbit to better understand and support Indian business. And so I see Chandrayaan 3 as kind of a vanguard and pointy-end example of what's possible. And then all these other businesses can move along in behind that example to be able to map India better, to keep track of the weather, to keep track of the changing crops, to provide good communications, to help provide navigation, all of the things that we do with our space assets. And the long, successful history of ISRO, the Space Research Organization, the fact that there are Indians right now who have been selected to fly in space as astronauts and that are training, and that the spaceships are being built, all of that is happening in amongst everything else in the world right now. And you need to take care of everybody. You need to spend the vast amount of your collected wealth on taking care of everyone and providing social services and health and welfare. But this small piece of it that is involved with exploration and inspiration and driving the cutting edge of business and making India technologically competitive with the rest of the world, that is also a really important piece of what's going on. And so Chandrayaan-3 is the most visible piece of it right now, but there's an entire pyramid of businesses right in behind that are really setting the path for India in its space future.
So where does this fit into the global picture, sir? In global space exploration, of course, the discovery of water, it all adds to our knowledge, as you mentioned. So in the global picture, where do you see this fitting in?
There are very few nations. There are almost 200 countries in the world. Only a handful can launch things into space successfully. And India has been launching things into space for decades already. They have a proven successful launch capability. So that sets India apart. But it's what you do with that launch capability that really matters. What satellites are you putting up? How is that benefiting humanity? How are you not only exploring, but how are you using space so it's good for the people of the country and good for people of the world? And India is also a world-leading member of that club, of that technological capability. And it's often, though, only when you push yourself right to the very edge of your capability that you can find out what you can actually do. It's why we have the Olympic Games, because without the Olympics, we wouldn't challenge ourselves to be our absolute very best, or to identify our citizens who are right the very best amongst us. And so trying to land Chandrayaan-3 on the moon, it's sort of like that, where you're challenging yourselves right to the very edge so that it can bring out the best in technology and the best in people. And to me, that overall mixture of challenge, of difficulty, and of the human inspiration and change in decision making that comes with it, that's the entire reality of Chandrayaan-3. Not just trying to safely land on the moon with this lander, but what it does for the nation itself historically. To me, that is the real measure of this space mission.
Okay. What for people watching the broadcast, sir, can you just give us a glimpse? I know you have to, feel it to believe it, but what's it like being on board the International Space Station?
One of the most tense moments on board a spaceship is when you're coming in to dock. And it's sort of like when you're coming down to land on the moon, because you've got this enormous space station or planet or whatever in front of you, and you have to guide your craft and control everything so that you touch it at exactly the right speed, in exactly the right spot. It's really demanding. And you spend years and years getting ready to try and successfully do that moment. But if you manage to successfully touch and get onto the surface of the outside of the space station or the surface of the moon, then that's when the mission really begins. And in our case, where you could then equalize pressure and open the hatch. And one of the most magical moments for me, and I've done it 3 times on different space stations, is after you have successfully docked, then you open the hatch, you grab on, and now you pull yourself into an entirely new world. You're now inside a human outpost that is out in space, and you can fly around weightless, which is just like, it's like you have a superpower. You can fly through this whole spaceship. And when you look out the window, you're going around the entire world every 90 minutes. I've crossed over India thousands and thousands of times. I've been around the world 2,650 times. So our understanding of our planet increases. And it's just such an exquisitely beautiful human experience. But it all comes down to that trial of competence. Can you do this thing? Can you dock? Can you land? Can you make that hard part happen? And I think what's going to be really exciting is after Vikram lands, and then with the ramp Pragyan can drive down the ramp and start to go do what we're actually there for. Try and run the experiments, sort of lick the moon, find out what it's truly made of, do all of the analysis, try and open up the book of understanding so that the next missions that come, when we have Chandrayaan-4 and Chandrayaan-5, that they can be even more capable until eventually there are people flying that ship down to land and go out and explore. And that is the exciting part for me. Not only the beauty of the personal experience, but how does this fit into human history and where is this leading us?
Yeah,
and you have that sense with you every single second while you're floating weightless on board.
As you're probably aware, Mr. Hadfield, we've started the Gaganyaan mission. So yes, training is happening. We are now trying to develop the modules of how we're going to do human spaceflight. Is a far different challenge from the satellite launches and of course Chandrayaan that we're doing currently. But when it happens, what is it like after having spent time in space and coming back to Earth?
Without gravity, when you're floating essentially weightless on a spaceship, your body is very different. How you balance, what your balance system in your inner ear is saying versus what your eyes are seeing, and your heart doesn't have to work nearly so hard because it doesn't have to lift your blood all the way up from your feet up to your head so that you can think. And there's all those different types of systems going on. Like you don't need a skeleton really anymore because you're not having to hold yourself up against gravity. So you start to lose your skeleton. You start to get weaker bones, osteoporosis. So when you come back to Earth, suddenly all those things have to reverse again. It's like a whole rehab, a whole rehabilitation. And when you first land, you're very dizzy. You feel sick. You feel weak. Gravity feels so incredibly unfair. It's crushing. I'd forgotten that your lips and your tongue have weight. It was weird to even talk because my tongue was being pushed down to the bottom of my mouth. And it takes a few days before you can reliably walk again. Now, they won't let you drive a car for a couple of weeks. It took about 4 months until running felt completely normal again, because running is, it's balance and cardiovascular and all those things happening simultaneously. But the thing that took the longest was my skeleton. And it took about 1.5 years for my bone density to get back to what it had been before I went to space. And so I was in space for 6 months. So that's about 3 to 1. So if you want to spend 2 weeks in space, it's going to take about 6 weeks to get your skeleton back again. And so all of those things were part of the life of a professional astronaut. But I would do it again in a heartbeat because it's just such a joyful and sort of ultimate human experience that, there's some rehab afterwards, but everybody does things they have to recover from.
Okay, some rehab.
And the real question is, are these things that you're doing worth the recovery? And for me, gosh, if
all right, you're not complaining. I don't think anybody going up in space is going to be
now.
complaining about having taken that journey. But going back to Chandrayaan-1, so as saying that the picture as as a human race, as a species, when we are putting the picture together, the discovery of water, sir. How big was that during the Chandrayaan-1 mission, especially when it comes to potential future permanent outposts on the moon?
Sometimes I think about how my body works, and it's almost entirely water. Our blood and all the liquid inside us, and it's water at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's almost like we are bringing a little bubble of warm, salty seawater around with us everywhere we go, inside our skin, so that we can stay alive. Water is essential to life. And so being able to find water somewhere besides Earth not only improves our chances of being there, because we need water to live, but also improves the chances of maybe finding life somewhere besides the Earth. And what Chandrayaan-1 and Chandrayaan-2 have shown us is that there's a tremendous amount of water on the moon, especially in the shadowed craters down where Chandrayaan-3 is headed. When we do the math, we think there's about 400 billion liters of water frozen into the surface of the moon. So that's a huge lake of water. And if there's water, then that means there's hydrogen for power and oxygen for breathing and water itself. So that really makes the moon a much more possible destination for humans to eventually live. And at the South Pole, also, because the moon is perfectly upright in the solar system, at the South Pole, they always get sunshine. So you have that wonderful combination of eternal sunshine, so you always have power, and the craters being full of water. And if you have water and you have power, then you just need a good habitat and you can live there. So yeah, the discovery of water on the moon, which Chandrayaan-1 was pivotal in helping to discover, that's really important for the future of human space exploration and maybe future human settlement. So yeah, we're just
all right. Okay, so let me ask you the controversial question, Mr. Hadfield. Who do you credit the discovery of water on the moon? Does NASA take the credit or does Chandrayaan take the credit?
Chandrayaan-1 wasn't the only mission that helped discover water on the moon, but its impactor, the Chandrayaan-1 probe that went down, it saw hydrogen and oxygen from its sensors in the surface of the moon. And then there have been lots of them since then. But until we actually land in the south of the moon and get down and dig into the surface and get a robotic handful of it, we'll never know for sure exactly what we're dealing with. But it's really tantalizing and interesting what missions like Chandrayaan-1 and the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and all of the missions since then, that they've been starting to teach us, and it's just opened up possibilities for what this means for the human future as well.
Okay, I have to ask you, Chris Hadfield, before we let you go, was it sitting on a night in the International Space Station that you decided that you're going to come back and write a book? What was the logic of this, after having literally been 2,500 times around the world in space, that you decided that it's time to write some fiction?
Imagine if you had been in space for the last 6 months and you'd undocked from your spaceship and your spaceship came down through the atmosphere and your parachute opened and you landed on the surface of the Earth and you're all dizzy and you crawl out of your spaceship and you stand up back on Earth. What do you do now? What do you do with the incredible difference of that human experience? And how do you share it with as many people as possible? How do you not just keep this amazing new human experience of starting to explore the rest of the universe? How do you share that properly with people? And it's why I write books. And as you say, the Apollo Murders, which is a thriller fiction book, has done superbly well. And I used it to help people see what it's actually like to fly in space. Because when you write it as a thriller fiction, you can tell the story from a lot of different people's perspectives, so you can really get into it. And the Apollo Murders is being made into an 8-part television series now as well. So that's a really lovely development. But my next book, which is The Defector, and I think you can see there's a copy of it cleverly placed behind me there, The Defector. I used to also be a fighter pilot and a test pilot. And it's a very dangerous profession, but a really interesting one. I've flown about 100 different types of airplanes, different fighters and big airplanes. And I thought it would be good to take the characters who had been in the Apollo Murders, my main characters, and what would happen next for them? Where would they go next? And And so I took this story, and it's alternative history fiction. I took this story from the war in Israel in the fall of 1973, with the people called the Yom Kippur War, right through to out in the American desert where Area 51 is, at a big dry lake bed called Groom Lake. And almost everything in that novel is true. Almost everything in that book is true. It actually happened. But I wove in a plot of what just might have happened, with a combination of test pilots and astronauts out there. And I'm really excited because the Defector, that comes out October 10th, is getting great reviews so far. And for me, on my side, I'm now writing the third book in that series. I'm doing deep research right now for what's going to happen after the Defector, to all of those characters. So for someone who has flown in space 3 times and seen the world the way that I have, and had all of these unusual experiences, now being able to write engaging thriller fiction is a great way for other people to experience them as well, I think, and also feel the excitement of it and the challenge of it and how things go wrong and how things can go right, and where it all might lead. So yeah, it's in amongst everything else that I'm doing, being able to write successful books. And the next book will be my 6th book. It's also a fun challenge, but also a great delight to be able to share the richness of all the experiences.
I think clearly we need to send a copy of it into space. All right, coming back, Mr. Hadfield, NASA had plans about sort of a permanent residence, permanent outpost on the moon by the end of the decade. Is that a realistic timeline?
The head of the Chinese space program said last month that China will have Chinese astronauts walking on the moon by 2030. No problem. Those are the words that came out of the mouth of the head of the Chinese space program. We will have Chinese astronauts walking on the moon by 2030. No problem. And that's the path that China is on. They've landed on the moon a couple of times already. They have a communications orbiter. They have people living on the Chinese space station right now. You know, they are doing that because they recognize that the moon is a huge untapped resource. We've literally just scratched the surface. And so they want, as one of the most powerful and leading nations in the world, they want to be part of that. In the United States, the same thing. The United States has already had people on the moon back 50 years ago. They have robots on the moon. They have things orbiting the moon. But now is the time, with the technology getting better, to start human settlement of the moon. And you want to land in the place where you have power and water, which is at the South Pole. And so suddenly we sort of have another space race, like when I was a kid. Who's going to be able to land first? And what does it mean for the laws? You know, the property rights. Whose laws apply? You know, if someone does something bad on the moon, then how do you enforce human behavior? And we have the United Nations working on it. We have the Outer Space Treaty. I had an organization called the Open Lunar Foundation, which is helping to set lunar policy for the world. I'm working with King Charles, in fact, on a document called the Astra Carta, which is looking to just try and build a common set of human values for space exploration and space utilization and space settlement. Because all of that, this is the moment in history when all of that is happening, when we are, for the very first time, sort of becoming, it's sort of like interplanetary. It's, you know, the moon isn't a planet, but how we settle the moon, that will kind of determine how we settle Mars when our technology gets good enough to do that. What are our interplanetary laws and rules, and how do we do all those things? And with the technology that SpaceX is building, with what China's doing, with what the United States is doing, and with what India is doing, we need to try and figure all that out. We need to try and build a common ethos of laws and rules and behaviors. And technology always moves faster than regulation, but regulation eventually catches up.
Yeah.
And that's this moment in history. And so not only am I excited for, Chandrayaan-3's landing and all the other things that are happening in space exploration, but I'm also very excited for how we can find ways to do the right thing together.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of my time working to be a positive influence in the future human exploration and settlement of the rest of the universe.
You won't believe it, Chris Hadfield, but we have already started having exactly those conversations here in India. I have hosted these conversations on television here in India. What happens in this charter for space? Looking first at the orbital space, because if we have 50,000 satellites going up every few years, every orbit might one day be contested. So Astrocarta, that makes eminent sense. Before I let you go, Mr. Hadfield, a quick talk about, you mentioned SpaceX. There's a booming space sector, private space sector in the US. It's also started here in India. You mentioned that you've seen some of these companies develop. What are your thoughts on them?
I think the Indian Space Research Organization is doing it really smart. They kind of laid all the groundwork. They built the launch capability. They put satellites in space. They kind of established how it could happen. But it took the entire national will to be able to do that. It was still really complicated. There was a very high risk and not very much financial return. And that's the same thing that NASA did. NASA needed to build the rockets and build the infrastructure and take all of those initial risks. But once you get to a certain stage, once you have a proven capability, now is the time that you can open it up for free enterprise, for private businesses, for businesses to make a profit from this big government investment. And Canada has done it very successfully. There are lots and lots of very successful Canadian space companies. The United States has done it brilliantly. They have thousands of space companies in the United States. And you mentioned SpaceX as probably the biggest example. But India has hundreds of space businesses. And the technology incubator that I work with and Dhruva Space that I'm working with, they are really good examples of how if you give people the opportunity and you show them an example, then the creativity of the human mind and the desire to succeed will move into that space. And it's great to see companies like Dhruva that are already have satellites in orbit, that are building manufacturing facilities in India so that India can be not only domestically taking advantage of it and successful, but then start to be internationally successful, selling their capability, their products, their services to the rest of the world as well. And that's why the government and India has been supporting ISRO for so long. And that is to build all of this capability so that now you can bear the fruit of it. And I'm really pleased to be able to help and work with several Indian companies. In fact, I'm working with several later today to give them the opportunity to have the combination of ideas and business capability and financial support so that they can grow and succeed. And that's where we are in history with Indian space exploration and development. And it's good that there are some really strong examples of success.
I promise you, we are as excited, and it's an exciting day. I remember as a young person reading Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot. I'm hoping, I was just speaking to my team, that I'm hoping that these are the moments of inspiration where we forget the petulance of day-to-day life and can think of something greater than ourselves. Thank you for sharing that moment with us. Appreciate your time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.